If you could time travel and grab a world map from 1900 and then another one from just a few decades later, you would be looking at two totally different worlds. I mean, it's one of the most dramatic transformations in all of human history. A world once dominated by just a handful of empires was completely redrawn, making way for dozens and dozens of new nations.
So the big question is, how did this happen, right? How on earth did so many new countries just appear on the map, all in a relatively short time? It's not one simple story, that's for sure. It's more like this complex web of pressure, politics, and a massive shift in global power.
Okay, so when historians really dig into this, what they find is pretty fascinating. It's not like there was just one way to get free. Turns out, there were really two main roads that these new nations took to gain their independence. One was through negotiation, and the other, well, that was through armed struggle.
All right, so let's tackle that first path, the negotiated one. And I've got to stress this right off the bat. Negotiated does not mean easy. This wasn't some friendly handshake where empires just decided to give away their colonies. No way. This was the result of immense, relentless pressure.
So what was the magic formula here? Well, it was like a perfect storm. From the inside, you had these powerful nationalist movements bubbling up, massive protests in the streets, and charismatic leaders who could rally millions. At the same time, from the outside, the old colonial powers were, frankly, a wreck. They were economically drained from 2 world wars, people back home were starting to question the whole idea of empire, and you had these new global superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, who were both, for their own reasons, pretty against old-school colonialism.
And India, wow, India is just the textbook example of this long, hard-fought struggle. I mean, the Indian National Congress formed all the way back in 1885. Then you have these galvanizing, horrific events like the Amritsar massacre, and of course, Mahatma Gandhi leading decades of nonviolent resistance, which, let's be clear, took incredible bravery and sacrifice from millions of people. It wasn't until 1947, with Britain just completely exhausted by World War II, that they finally realized they couldn't hold on anymore. This was a victory that took generations to win.
And you see the same pattern playing out in other places too. Take Ghana, which was then called the Gold Coast. You had a powerful leader, Kwame Nkrumah, who really capitalized on the fact that the British public was just sick of paying for the empire. Boom, independence in 1957. Same story in French West Africa. France looked at the books, looked at the resources it would take to keep control after the war, and just said, we can't do it. And so most of those territories got their independence by 1959.
But for a whole lot of other colonies, talking out just wasn't an option. For them, the only way out, the only path to freedom, was through the barrel of a gun.
So, what was the tipping point? What's the one thing that pushed some places toward war while others could negotiate? When you look at the history, one factor just screams out at you again and again: European settlers. A large population of settlers who saw the colony as their home and who would fight to the death to keep their power.
And you can see this difference so clearly, even within the same empire. Look at France. In French West Africa, you had relatively few French officials and soldiers, so the road to independence was, well, mostly peaceful. But then you look at Algeria. Oh man. In Algeria, you had over 1 million French settlers, the Pieds Noirs they were called. And they didn't see themselves as living in a colony. To them, Algeria was France. So the idea of Algerian independence, they fought it tooth and nail. And the result was a horrific, bloody war.
And when I say brutal, I mean it. This was an 8-year-long nightmare. The Algerian FLN fought a brutal guerrilla war, and the French army's response was just as vicious. We're talking torture, mass reprisals. It was awful. The whole thing nearly tore France itself apart. It wasn't until the legendary Charles de Gaulle came back to power and basically said, "This is unwinnable," that France finally negotiated Algeria's independence in 1962. But my God, the cost was just immense.
You see a really similar situation in Angola, which was a Portuguese colony. A war for independence just dragged on, turning into this bloody stalemate. Neither side could get the upper hand. So, what breaks a deadlock like that? What could possibly change the game?
Well, the answer is kind of wild, because it came from a totally unexpected place. It wasn't some big battle in Angola that decided things. It was a revolution back in Portugal. In 1974, there was this mostly peaceful military coup called the Carnation Revolution that kicked out the old dictatorship. And the new government in Lisbon, their first order of business was ending the colonial wars. They want it out, and they want it out now.
But here's what we see this tragic pattern start to emerge. Just because you get independence doesn't mean the fighting stops. In Angola, as soon as the Portuguese left, the different liberation movements, which were backed by the US and the Soviets, immediately started fighting each other, and that kicked off a civil war that lasted for decades. And look at Vietnam. They defeat the French, but then the country gets split in two, which sets the stage for the even bigger, even more devastating Vietnam War, another proxy battleground for the Cold War.
Right, so this is the really crucial point. Getting independence, whether through talks or through war, wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The departing empires left behind this absolute mess. A really painful legacy that, honestly, the world is still dealing with today.
And at the very heart of that legacy, arbitrary borders. Just think about that for a second. These are lines drawn on a map by some official in London or Paris who probably never even set foot in the country. They drew them for their own administrative convenience or to control a river or grab some resources. They paid zero attention to the actual people living there, the different ethnic groups, the different religions, the ancient rivalries. They just drew a line.
And maybe the most heartbreaking, catastrophic example of this in all of history was the partition of British India. The British decided they needed to create a separate country for the Muslim minority, which would become Pakistan. So they brought in a British lawyer who had never been to India before, and he literally just drew a line on a map, slicing right through ancient communities where Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs had lived side by side for centuries.
The result, one of the biggest, fastest, most chaotic mass migrations in the history of the world. Imagine this, 15 million people. 15 million people forced to pack up whatever they could carry and flee for their lives.
And in the absolute horror of the violence that exploded along that new border, it's estimated that about 1 million people were killed. 1 million dead, all because of a line on a map.
And sadly, this wasn't a one-off thing. You see a similar story in Nigeria. The British basically just mashed together hundreds of different ethnic groups into one country. So after independence, you get these massive power struggles between the biggest groups, the Igbo, the Yoruba, and the House of Fulani. And that eventually led to military coups and the absolutely devastating Biafran War, when the Igbo people tried to break away.
And hey, don't think for a second this is just an issue in Africa or Asia. Even in a country like Canada, the Quebec separatist movement has its roots right in this colonial history, that old division between French and British Canada. It's a fight over identity and culture that's led to multiple votes on whether to split the country.
So at the end of the day, it's so clear that these huge historical shifts didn't just stop when a new flag was raised. They've left these deep echoes that are still bouncing around our world today.
So let's just quickly recap the big takeaways, right? You've got the two main paths to freedom. Path 1, negotiation. That perfect storm of internal pressure meeting an empire that's just too weak to hold on. Path 2, armed conflict, usually lit on fire by a settler population that refuses to give up power. And then, hanging over everything, is this toxic legacy of the borders they left behind, a major reason we still see so much instability and conflict all over the world.
And that really brings us to a final question for you to think about. When you look around the world today, when you see news about conflicts over borders, or groups fighting for self-determination, or even just debates about what a national identity really means, where do you see the echoes of this history playing out? Because once you start looking for them, you see them everywhere.